The fluorescent lights of Conference Room B buzzed overhead as Captain Jessica Kane clicked through another mundane training slide. Her voice steady and professional as she explained supply chain protocols to a room full of bored soldiers. At 32, she moved with an efficiency that seemed almost too precise for someone whose biggest responsibility was formatting PowerPoint, presentations, and scheduling briefings. What none of them knew was that just 3 years ago, this same woman had commanded the most elite special forces unit in modern military history, leading high-risk extraction missions across 4 continents under the call sign Viper 7. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now Jessica Kane was just the PowerPoint girl at Camp Iron Ridge Training Center in Arizona, relegated to administrative duties that had her creating slide presentations about logistics, inventory management, and safety protocols. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd once planned and executed missions that saved hundreds of lives, and now her most challenging task was choosing the right font for quarterly reports. The morning routine at Camp Iron Ridge began at 0530 hours, but Jessica had been awake since 0500, sitting on the edge of her narrow bunk in the junior staff quarters. Her small room was spartanly furnished, a single bed, a metal desk, and a footlocker that contained everything she owned. What would have surprised anyone who bothered to look closely was the military precision with which everything was arranged. Her boots sat perfectly aligned, her uniforms hung with exact spacing, and even her toiletries were organized with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of habits formed under life or death circumstances. She dressed quickly in her standard Army combat uniform, the same ACS worn by every other administrative staff member on base. But where others might have wrinkled sleeves or slightly crooked name tapes, Jessica's uniform was immaculate. Every crease was sharp, every button aligned, every piece of equipment positioned exactly where regulations demanded. It was the kind of presentation that should have impressed her superiors, but instead, it was largely ignored by people who saw her as nothing more than a glorified secretary. Jessica made her way to the base cafeteria, moving through the early morning darkness with the silent, purposeful stride of someone accustomed to moving unseen. The dining facility was nearly empty at this hour, occupied only by a few early-rising cooks and maintenance personnel. She selected black coffee and a simple breakfast, eating alone at a corner table while reviewing the day's briefing schedule. On her tablet, her first appointment was at 0800 hours at safety briefing for new recruits about proper equipment handling. It was the kind of presentation she could deliver in her sleep, filled with basic information that any soldier should know, but somehow needed to be repeatedly explained. As she walked toward the training facility, Jessica caught fragments of conversation from passing soldiers. "PowerPoint girls got first shift again," she heard someone mutter with obvious disdain. "At least she's good for something," came the reply, followed by muffled laughter. Jessica's expression never changed, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd learned long ago that reacting to such comments only made them worse. Better to remain invisible, to do her job with quiet competence, and to avoid drawing the kind of attention that might raise uncomfortable questions about her past. The training facility buzzed with the chaotic energy of soldiers preparing for another day of instruction. Camp Iron Ridge specialized in advanced tactical training, preparing units for deployment to high-risk environments around the world. It should have been exactly the kind of place where Jessica's experience would be invaluable, but instead, she was relegated to the administrative sidelines, creating presentations that others would deliver to students who desperately needed the kind of real-world knowledge she possessed. Lieutenant Colonel Ryan Blackwood commanded the facility with the swagger of someone who'd built his reputation on aggressive leadership and uncompromising standards. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the confidence of an officer who'd never been truly challenged. His combat experience was solid but unremarkable: 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, all in conventional units that had seen action but never the kind of specialized operations that tested a soldier's true limits. Kane, Blackwood's voice, cut across the preparation area as Jessica set up her laptop and projector. Make sure those slides are ready to go. We've got 40 new recruits who need to understand that this isn't summer camp. Yes, sir, Jessica replied crisply, not looking up from her equipment. She'd learned that the less she said in these interactions, the better. Blackwood seemed to interpret any response longer than absolutely necessary as insubordination or, worse, an attempt to engage him in actual military discussion. Sergeant First Class Tyler Mason slouched against a nearby wall, watching Jessica, with the kind of smirk that suggested he found her very existence amusing. Mason was younger than Jessica, probably in his mid-20s, with the kind of cocky attitude that came from being good at conventional military skills, without ever being tested by truly difficult circumstances. He'd scored well in basic training, performed adequately in his first deployment, and had somehow convinced himself that this made him an expert on military competence. "Hey, PowerPoint," Mason called out, using the nickname that had stuck to Jessica like glue. "You remember to include the part about not dropping your weapon, or do we need to add that to slide 15? Several other soldiers chuckled, and Jessica felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest. The joke wasn't even particularly clever, but it served its purpose, reminding everyone present that she was considered the least militarily competent person in the room. "All safety protocols are covered in the presentation, Sergeant," Jessica responded evenly, continuing to adjust her projector settings. "All safety protocols," Mason repeated in a mocking tone. Must be nice to learn everything from PowerPoint slides instead of actually doing it. The laughter grew louder, and Jessica saw Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood watching the exchange with obvious amusement. He made no effort to redirect the conversation or remind his soldiers that she outranked Mason, at least technically. In the informal hierarchy of Camp Iron Ridge, rank seemed to matter less than perceived competence, and Jessica had been firmly categorized as someone whose opinions didn't merit serious consideration. As the recruits filed into the training room, Jessica couldn't help but notice their expressions. They looked at her the way students might regard a substitute teacher, with polite attention masking complete disrespect. These young soldiers were here to learn about combat, about real military operations, about the skills that would keep them alive in hostile environments. Instead, they were getting a presentation from someone they'd been told was basically a clerk with captain's bars. Jessica began her presentation with the same professional demeanor she brought to every briefing. Her voice was clear and confident, her slides well organized and informative. But she could see the glazed looks in the audience, the subtle eye rolls when they thought she wasn't looking, the general atmosphere of people enduring something they considered irrelevant to their actual military development. What none of them knew was that every safety protocol she was explaining had been learned through personal experience in environments where mistakes meant death. The equipment handling procedures she demonstrated had been refined during missions where split-second decisions determined success or failure. The communication protocol she outlined had been developed and tested in situations where radio silence was the difference between completing an objective and triggering an international incident. But Jessica Kane, former commander of Viper 7, kept these experiences to herself. She'd made a conscious choice 3 years ago to bury that part of her life, to start over in a role where her past couldn't hurt anyone else. The decision had cost her everything she'd worked for, but it had seemed like the only way to honor the memory of the people she'd failed to bring home. As she clicked through slides about proper weapon maintenance and safety procedures, Jessica thought about Captain David Park, her former second-in-command and closest friend. David had died because of her decision, because of a choice she'd made under pressure that had seemed right at the time but had ultimately cost him his life. The guilt of that failure had driven her to request reassignment to training duties, where she could help prepare other soldiers without putting them directly at risk. The irony was that her current position actually put soldiers at greater risk, because the training they were receiving was incomplete, delivered by instructors who lacked the real-world experience to prepare them for the realities they would face. But Jessica had convinced herself that this was better than the alternative, that her presence in operational roles would only lead to more good, people dying because of her failures. She concluded her presentation to polite but unenthusiastic applause, packed up her equipment, and prepared for the next session. As the recruits filed out, she heard Mason's voice carrying clearly across the room. "Well, that was another thrilling hour of PowerPoint warfare. Think she's ever actually held a weapon outside of training?" The comment stung because it was so completely wrong, and yet Jessica couldn't correct it without revealing exactly the kind of information she'd spent 3 years trying to keep buried. Instead, she quietly gathered her materials and prepared for the next presentation. The next group of soldiers who would look at her with barely concealed contempt, while she tried to teach them lessons that might someday save their lives. What Jessica didn't notice was Master Sergeant Vincent Torres watching her from the back of the room, his experienced eyes noting details that others missed. Torres had 20 years of military experience, including time with special operations units, and he recognized something in Jessica's bearing that didn't match her current assignment. The way she moved, the precision of her equipment handling, the depth of knowledge she displayed even in basic presentations, all of it suggested someone with far more experience than her file indicated. But Torres kept his observations to himself, at least for now. In his experience, people who ended up in positions that didn't match their apparent capabilities usually had good reasons for being there. The question was whether those reasons would eventually come to light, and what would happen when they did. The afternoon brought Jessica's second briefing of the day, this time to a group of mid-level NCOs who were attending an advanced leadership course. These were seasoned soldiers with multiple deployments and years of experience, which somehow made their dismissive attitude toward her even more frustrating. They filed into the conference room with the weary expressions of people who'd been forced to sit through too many administrative presentations. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood introduced her with his usual lack of enthusiasm. "Captain Kane will be covering the new protocols for after-action reports and documentation procedures. Try to stay awake." The comment drew chuckles from the audience and set the tone for what would follow. Jessica began her presentation professionally, but she could feel the room's collective indifference like a physical weight. These were men and women who'd led soldiers in combat, who'd made life-or-death decisions under fire, and they were being lectured about paperwork by someone they viewed as a bureaucrat who'd never left the continental United States. The new reporting format requires detailed timeline documentation, Jessica explained, clicking to a slide that showed the required fields. Each significant event must be logged with precise timestamps and supporting evidence. Staff Sergeant Maria Gonzalez raised her hand with obvious skepticism. "Ma'am, with respect, have you ever actually filed an after-action report from a combat zone? Because some of this stuff you're asking for, it's not exactly practical when people are shooting at you." The question was posed politely, but Jessica could hear the underlying challenge. Gonzalez was a decorated combat veteran with 3 tours in Afghanistan, and her doubt about Jessica's qualifications was written clearly across her face. "The procedures are designed to ensure comprehensive documentation," Jessica replied carefully, avoiding the direct question. "Proper record keeping is essential for learning from operational experiences." "That's not really an answer," interrupted Sergeant First Class Tyler Mason, who'd apparently decided to attend this session as well. "The question was whether you've ever actually been in a situation where you had to worry about anything more dangerous than a paper cut." The room erupted in quiet laughter, and Jessica felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. Mason had a talent for cutting directly to the heart of her perceived inadequacy, and he seemed to enjoy exercising it whenever possible. "Sergeant Mason," she said evenly, "the focus should be on understanding the requirements, not on personal experiences." "Personal experiences are exactly what make these requirements relevant or irrelevant," Mason shot back. "No offense, ma'am, but it's hard to take seriously advice about combat documentation from someone whose biggest operational challenge is making sure the slide transitions work properly." This time the laughter was more open, and Jessica saw several of the NCOs nodding in agreement. From their perspective, Mason was simply voicing what everyone was thinking, that she was fundamentally unqualified to teach them anything about military operations. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood watched the exchange with amusement, clearly enjoying the dynamic. In his mind, this was probably character building for his subordinates, teaching them to question authority and think critically about the information they received. What he failed to recognize was that his tolerance for Jessica's humiliation was creating a toxic environment, where competence was judged by appearances rather than actual knowledge. Jessica pushed through the rest of her presentation, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the increasingly hostile audience. When she reached the section on communication protocols during high-stress situations, she found herself thinking about the dozens of operations where these exact procedures had saved lives. She remembered coordinating with air support while under heavy fire, maintaining radio discipline during infiltration missions, and ensuring that critical information reached the right people even when communication systems were compromised. But she couldn't share any of those experiences without revealing exactly the kind of operational background she was trying to keep hidden. Instead, she had to endure lectures from soldiers with a fraction of her experience about the impracticality of procedures she'd helped develop and refine in actual combat situations. "Ma'am," said Staff Sergeant James Wright, a tank commander with 2 Bronze Stars, "this communication protocol you're showing us, it's got way too many steps. In a real firefight, nobody's got time for all this bureaucratic nonsense." Jessica looked at the slide displaying the protocol she'd personally used to coordinate a multi-agency hostage rescue in Somalia 3 years earlier. The bureaucratic nonsense Wright was dismissing had been instrumental in ensuring that 6 different units could operate in the same area without accidentally engaging each other. "The protocol is designed to prevent communication failures," she explained, her voice remaining steady despite her growing frustration. "Proper coordination can be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." "Easy to say when you're sitting in an air-conditioned office," Mason interjected. "Maybe if you'd actually been downrange, you'd understand why simplicity beats complexity every time." The comment hit particularly hard because it revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of how complex operations actually worked. Jessica had spent years learning that successful missions required incredibly detailed coordination, that the simple solutions Mason preferred were exactly what got people killed when multiple units were operating in confined spaces. But she couldn't correct his misconception without explaining how she knew he was wrong, and that explanation would require revealing operational details she'd sworn never to discuss. Instead, she nodded politely and moved to the next slide, swallowing her frustration and accepting another small humiliation. After the session ended, Jessica overheard a conversation that crystallized just how completely her colleagues had misjudged her capabilities. Wright and Gonzalez were talking near the coffee machine, their voices carrying clearly across the empty conference room. "I almost feel bad for her," Gonzalez was saying. "She's trying so hard to sound like she knows what she's talking about, but it's obvious she's never been anywhere near real action." "Yeah," Wright agreed. "I mean, she seems nice enough, but putting her in charge of teaching operational procedures, it's like asking a driving instructor to teach Formula One racing." Jessica quietly packed her equipment, listening to them discuss. her incompetence with the casual certainty of people who'd never considered that their assumptions might be wrong. The comparison to a driving instructor was particularly painful, because it demonstrated how completely they'd underestimated not just her experience, but her understanding of the very concepts they claimed she couldn't grasp. As she walked back to her quarters, Jessica reflected on the impossible position she'd created for herself. By hiding her background, she'd made it inevitable that experienced soldiers would question her qualifications. But revealing her true experience would require explaining why she'd left special operations, and that conversation would inevitably lead to questions about Captain David Park and the mission that had ended her operational career. She'd chosen this path because it seemed like the least harmful option, but she was beginning to realize that her decision to hide her capabilities might actually be putting future soldiers at risk. The training they were receiving was incomplete, delivered by instructors who meant well, but lacked the depth of experience necessary to prepare them for the realities they would face. That evening, Jessica made her way to the base gym, hoping that physical exercise might help clear her mind. The facility was nearly empty at this late hour, occupied only by a few dedicated soldiers maintaining their fitness routines. She found an empty corner and began a workout routine that was far more intense than anything her colleagues would have expected from the PowerPoint girl. Her exercise regimen reflected the same hidden competence as everything else about her current life. While others might spend an hour on cardio equipment or basic weight training, Jessica worked through a complex routine designed to maintain the kind of physical conditioning required for special operations. Her movements were precise and efficient, her form perfect, her intensity suggesting someone who understood that physical fitness wasn't just about health, it was about operational readiness. Master Sergeant Torres happened to be finishing his own workout when he noticed Jessica's routine. He watched with growing interest as she moved through exercises that were far more advanced than anything typically seen in a base gym. Her technique was flawless, her stamina impressive, and her overall approach suggested someone with extensive training in combat conditioning. Torres had seen enough special operations personnel to recognize the signs, and Jessica's workout routine was setting off every alarm bell in his experienced mind. The question was what to do with this information, and whether his growing suspicions about her background were worth investigating further. As Jessica completed her routine and prepared to leave, she caught Torres watching her. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with anxiety. It was the look of someone who was beginning to put pieces together, someone who might soon start asking questions she wasn't prepared to answer. She nodded politely and left the gym, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed anonymity was beginning to crack. The question was whether she could maintain her cover long enough to complete her self-imposed exile, or whether the truth about Viper 7 was about to surface in ways she couldn't control. The following week brought a new low point in Jessica's carefully managed invisibility. She'd been assigned to assist with a tactical communications exercise, ostensibly to handle administrative support and ensure proper documentation. In reality, she found herself functioning as little more than an equipment carrier for instructors who viewed her presence as an unwelcome obligation. The exercise was being conducted in the desert training area outside Camp Iron Ridge, where multiple units would practice coordinating complex maneuvers under simulated combat conditions. It was exactly the kind of training Jessica had once designed and executed at the highest levels, but now she was relegated to carrying clipboards and ensuring that RADIO batteries were properly distributed. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood gathered the participating instructors for a pre-exercise briefing, and Jessica stood at the back of the group with her stack of administrative materials. The conversation quickly turned technical, focusing on communication protocols, coordination procedures, and the specific challenges of managing multiple units in complex terrain. "The biggest risk is going to be frequency conflicts," explained Major Sarah Chun, the communications officer. "We've got 4 different units operating in overlapping areas, and if they start stepping on each other's transmissions, the whole exercise falls apart." "What about backup frequencies?" asked Captain Rodriguez, one of the unit commanders. "If primary channels get jammed or compromised, we need alternatives that won't create interference." Jessica found herself listening to a discussion of problems she'd solved dozens of times in actual operations. The frequency management issues they were worried about had been addressed in special operations units years ago through techniques she'd personally helped develop. The backup communication procedures they were debating were crude compared to methods she'd used successfully in hostile environments where communication failure meant mission catastrophe. But when she stepped forward to contribute to the discussion, Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood cut her off before she could speak. "Kane, we need you to get the equipment distributed to the units. This is a technical discussion for operational personnel." The dismissal was delivered with casual authority, as if Jessica's input was so obviously irrelevant that it didn't merit consideration. The other instructors barely glanced in her direction, accepting Blackwood's judgment that she had nothing valuable to contribute to operational planning. Jessica bit back her response and returned to her assigned role of equipment distribution. As she handed out radio batteries and documentation packets, she listened to the instructors struggle with coordination problems that she could have solved with a few simple adjustments to their procedures. The exercise itself was a disaster from the beginning. Within the first hour, 2 units had accidentally jammed each other's frequencies. A 3rd unit had lost contact with command entirely, and a 4th was broadcasting on the wrong channel and creating interference for everyone else. Jessica watched from her position in the command post as the carefully planned exercise devolved into chaos. "Unit 3, switch to backup frequency," Major Chun commanded over the radio, her voice betraying growing frustration. "Negative, backup frequency is compromised," came the response. "We're getting massive interference from an unknown source." Jessica knew immediately what the problem was. The unknown source was Unit 4, which was broadcasting on a frequency that created harmonic interference with Unit 3's backup channel. It was a basic frequency management issue that could be resolved in minutes with proper coordination, but the command staff was struggling to identify the source of the problem. She approached Major Chun with a possible solution. "Ma'am, if you check Unit 4's frequency assignment against the harmonic chart, you might find..." "Captain Kane," Chun interrupted without looking up from her radio equipment, "I need you to focus on your administrative duties. We'll handle the technical problems." Jessica returned to her clipboard, watching in frustration as the exercise continued to deteriorate. Units were operating without proper coordination. Communication was breaking down regularly, and the training objectives were being completely abandoned as everyone struggled with basic connectivity issues. "Sergeant," First Class Mason's voice crackled over the command frequency. "Command, this is ridiculous. How are we supposed to practice tactical maneuvers when we can't even talk to each other? Maybe next time we should get someone who actually understands communications to plan this thing." The comment was clearly directed at the planning staff, but Jessica felt it like a personal attack. She'd been excluded from the planning process specifically because her colleagues assumed she lacked the technical knowledge to contribute meaningfully. The irony was that her expertise could have prevented every problem they were experiencing. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood's response revealed his own growing frustration. "All units, adapt and overcome. Real combat doesn't come with perfect communications, so figure it out." It was exactly the wrong response, the kind of leadership that mistook improvisation for competence and blamed subordinates for failures that originated at the command level. Jessica had served under officers like Blackwood before, leaders who covered their own inadequacies by demanding that others make it work, without providing the tools or guidance necessary for success. The exercise concluded 3 hours behind schedule with most objectives unmet and several units having experienced complete communication failures. During the after-action review, Jessica listened to a discussion of lessons learned that completely missed the actual causes of the problems they'd experienced. "Communications were challenging today," Blackwood summarized, "but that's realistic. In actual combat, you won't have perfect connectivity, so you need to be prepared for equipment failures and interference." Jessica wanted to scream. The problems they'd experienced weren't realistic combat conditions. They were basic technical failures that could have been easily prevented with proper planning and frequency management. By mischaracterizing their failures as valuable training experiences, Blackwood was ensuring that future exercises would repeat the same mistakes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After the debriefing, Jessica overheard a conversation between Major Chun and Captain Rodriguez that perfectly encapsulated her colleague's perception of her role. At least the PowerPoint girl kept track of all the equipment. Chun was saying, "That's about the level of complexity she can handle." "Yeah," Rodriguez agreed. "Can you imagine if we'd actually let her participate in the planning? We'd probably still be out there trying to figure out which end of the radio to talk into." Their laughter followed Jessica as she loaded equipment into the transport vehicles. Each joke a reminder of how completely they'd underestimated her capabilities. What made it particularly painful was knowing that their dismissive assumptions were directly contributing to the training failures they'd just experienced. That evening, Jessica sat alone in her quarters, staring at a photograph she kept hidden in her desk drawer. It showed her standing with the members of Viper 7 after a successful hostage rescue operation in Syria. Captain David Park stood beside her, his arm draped over her shoulder in the easy camaraderie of soldiers who trusted each other with their lives. The mission had been similar to today's exercise in some ways. Multiple units operating in complex terrain with challenging communication requirements. But Viper 7 had executed it flawlessly because they'd spent months developing and refining the exact coordination procedures that today's instructors had dismissed as too complicated. David had been her communication specialist, among other things. He'd understood that effective coordination wasn't about having perfect equipment. It was about having perfect procedures. The techniques they'd developed together could have solved every problem the exercise had experienced. But those techniques were buried with David and the rest of Jessica's operational past. She closed the photograph and returned it to its hiding place, but the memory of David's voice lingered in her mind. "The best plans are the ones that work when everything goes wrong," he'd always said. "If your procedures can't handle Murphy's Law, they're not procedures, they're just suggestions." Today's exercise had been full of suggestions masquerading as procedures, and the results had been predictable. Soldiers who deserved better training were being shortchanged by instructors who confused confidence with competence, and Jessica was powerless to help them because revealing her knowledge would require explaining how she'd acquired it. "Master." Sergeant Torres knocked on her door just after 2,100 hours. Carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Ma'am, do you have a few minutes?" he asked quietly. Jessica gestured him inside, wondering if her growing anxiety was justified. Torres had been watching her more carefully lately, and she was beginning to suspect that his observations were leading him toward conclusions she wasn't prepared to address. "Hell of a day out there," Torres said, settling into the single chair her quarters provided. "Yes, it was challenging," Jessica replied carefully. Torres studied her face for a moment before continuing. "Ma'am, I've been in the Army for 20 years. I've seen a lot of exercises go sideways, and I've worked with a lot of different kinds of officers. Most of the time when things go wrong, like they did today, the people in charge are scrambling to figure out solutions." He paused, his eyes never leaving her face. "But you weren't scrambling. You were watching everything fall apart like you already knew exactly what was wrong and how to fix it. That's not the reaction of someone who's learning. That's the reaction of someone who's already been there. Jessica felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. Torres wasn't making accusations or demands. He was simply stating observations that were becoming impossible to deny. The question was whether she could continue to deflect his attention or whether her secret was about to become significantly less secret. "Sergeant Torres," she said quietly, "I appreciate your confidence, but I think you're giving me more credit than I deserve." Torres smiled, but there was no humor in his expression. "Ma'am, with respect, I think the problem is that everyone else is giving you a lot less credit than you deserve. The question is why you're letting them." After Torres left her quarters, Jessica lay awake staring at the ceiling until well past midnight. His words echoed in her mind, particularly his observation about why she was letting people underestimate her. The answer was buried in memories she'd spent 3 years trying to forget, but tonight they demanded attention with the persistence of ghosts seeking recognition. She rose quietly and walked to her small desk, retrieving the hidden photograph. Once more, in the dim light from her desk lamp, the faces of Viper 7 seemed almost alive. 12 of the most elite soldiers she'd ever known, specialists in operations that officially didn't exist. Captain David Park's smile was particularly vivid, frozen in a moment of triumph that had occurred. Just hours before everything went wrong, the mission had been designated Operation Nightfall, a hostage rescue in the mountains of Afghanistan where a team of international aid workers had been captured by a Taliban splinter group. Intelligence indicated that the hostages were being held in a fortified compound accessible only through treacherous mountain passes, and conventional rescue operations had been deemed too risky due to the terrain and the likelihood of hostage casualties. Viper 7 had been tasked with what seemed impossible: infiltrate the compound, neutralize the captors, and extract 6 hostages without alerting nearby enemy forces. Jessica had spent weeks planning the operation, coordinating with air support, intelligence assets, and local Afghan forces who would provide perimeter security. David had been instrumental in developing the communication protocols that would allow the team to coordinate with multiple support elements while maintaining operational security. His technical expertise was matched by an intuitive understanding of how electronic warfare could compromise even the most sophisticated equipment, and he designed backup systems that could function even under the worst possible conditions. The infiltration had gone perfectly. Viper 7 had approached the compound undetected, neutralized the sentries, and breached the main building without triggering any alarms. The hostages were located exactly where intelligence had indicated, and the initial extraction had proceeded according to plan. But as they prepared to evacuate, Jessica had been forced to make a command decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Drone surveillance had detected a large enemy force moving toward their position, apparently unrelated to their mission, but positioned to intercept their planned escape route. She had 2 choices: abort the mission and try to escape with the hostages using their primary route, risking engagement with superior numbers, or attempt an alternate extraction that would require splitting her team. Jessica had chosen to split. Viper 7. 6 operators would escort the hostages along the original route, while the remaining 6, led by David, would create a diversion to draw the enemy force away from the extraction point. It was a tactically sound decision that maximized the chances of mission success, but it required her 2 best teams to operate independently in hostile territory with limited support. The diversion had worked perfectly. David's team had engaged the enemy force and successfully drawn them away from the extraction route, allowing Jessica's group to evacuate the hostages without contact. But as David's team attempted their own withdrawal, they'd encountered a second enemy force that intelligence had failed to detect. Jessica could still remember David's final radio transmission, delivered with the calm professionalism that had defined his military career. Viper 7 Alpha. This is Bravo Team. We are heavily engaged and cannot break contact. Continue with primary mission. Do not attempt support. Repeat, do not attempt support. She'd faced another impossible decision. David's team was pinned down and taking casualties. But attempting to support them would require abandoning the hostages and potentially compromising the entire mission. Military doctrine was clear. The mission came first, and commanders couldn't risk additional lives trying to save personnel who were already compromised. But David Park wasn't just personnel, he was her friend, her trusted second-in-command, and one of the finest soldiers she'd ever known. The tactical decision was obvious, but the personal cost was devastating. Jessica had followed doctrine. She'd completed the evacuation, delivered the hostages safely to friendly forces, and only then had she been able to attempt a recovery operation. For David's team, by the time they reached the engagement site, David and 2 other operators were dead, killed while holding their position to ensure the mission's success. The after-action review had praised Jessica's leadership and tactical decision-making. Viper 7 had successfully completed an impossible mission with minimal casualties, and the rescued hostages had provided intelligence that prevented several planned terrorist attacks. From an operational standpoint, Operation Nightfall had been a complete success, but Jessica couldn't forget the look in David's eyes during their final face-to-face conversation before the mission began. He'd expressed concerns about the intelligence they'd received, worried that the enemy situation was more complex than their briefings had indicated. She dismissed his concerns as pre-mission anxiety, confident in her planning and the capabilities of her team. If she'd listened to David's instincts, if she'd demanded additional intelligence gathering before authorizing the mission, if she'd been more cautious about splitting her team, David might still be alive. The tactical success couldn't erase the personal failure she felt every time she remembered his final transmission. The guilt had consumed her for months after the mission. She'd continued to lead Viper 7 with the same professional competence that had always defined her career, but the easy confidence that had once made her legendary was gone. Every decision became a struggle between tactical necessity and the fear of making another choice that would cost good people their lives. The breaking point had come 6 months later during a mission briefing for another high-risk operation. As Jessica outlined the plan to her team, she'd seen David's replacement, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, studying the operational details with the same careful attention that David had always shown. Webb was competent and professional, but he lacked David's intuitive understanding of how operations could go wrong in unexpected ways. Jessica had realized in that moment that she was planning another mission where she might have to sacrifice team members to achieve operational objectives, and she couldn't face the possibility of losing more people due to her command decisions. She'd requested immediate reassignment to training duties, citing burnout and a desire to help prepare future special operations personnel. Her superiors had been reluctant to lose one of their most effective unit commanders, but they'd eventually agreed to her request. Jessica had been reassigned to Camp Iron Ridge with the understanding that her special operations background would remain classified to protect ongoing operations and to allow her to transition to her new role without the burden of past achievements. What she hadn't anticipated was how completely her colleagues would misinterpret her desire for anonymity. She'd expected to be able to contribute quietly to training programs, sharing her expertise in ways that didn't require revealing specific operational details. Instead, she'd been relegated to administrative duties and treated like someone whose military experience was limited to PowerPoint presentations. The irony was that her self-imposed exile was preventing her from accomplishing the very goal that had motivated her career change. She'd wanted to help prepare soldiers for the realities of special operations, but her hidden background made it impossible for her to provide the kind of advanced training that could actually save lives. Now, 3 years later, Jessica was watching history repeat itself. Soldiers were receiving inadequate training from instructors who meant well but lacked the experience to prepare them for what they would actually face. The communication failures she'd witnessed during the recent exercise were exactly the kind of problems that got people killed in real operations, but she couldn't correct them without revealing knowledge that would raise uncomfortable questions about her past. As she returned the photograph to its hiding place, Jessica wondered if David would approve of the choice she'd made. She'd honored his sacrifice by leaving special operations, but she'd failed to honor his commitment to ensuring that other soldiers received the best possible preparation for the dangers they would face. Torres had been right to question why she was allowing people to underestimate her. The answer was that she'd been afraid of making decisions that might cost more lives, afraid of facing the kind of responsibility that had led to David's death, and afraid of discovering that she wasn't the leader she'd once believed herself to be. But her fear was now contributing to the very problems she'd hoped to prevent. By hiding her capabilities, she was allowing inadequate training to continue. And inadequate training was exactly what had made David's sacrifice necessary in the first place. Jessica sat in the darkness of her quarters, finally beginning to understand that her self-imposed exile wasn't protecting anyone. It was just another form of abandoning her responsibilities. The question was whether she had the courage to reclaim the identity she'd spent 3 years trying to bury, and whether she could find a way to honor David's memory by ensuring that his death had taught her lessons worth sharing. Outside her window, the desert wind carried the distant sounds of soldiers preparing for another day of training. Tomorrow would bring more presentations, more dismissive comments, and more opportunities to watch preventable problems unfold while she remained silent on the sidelines. But Torres had seen through her carefully constructed facade, and his questions were forcing her to confront truths she'd been avoiding. The PowerPoint girl was a creation of her own guilt and fear, but underneath that protective identity, Viper 7's commander was still alive, still capable, and still responsible for the lives of soldiers who deserved better than the training they were currently receiving. The following Monday morning brought news that would shatter Jessica's carefully maintained routine and force her to confront the very fears she'd been avoiding for 3 years. Colonel Rebecca Stone, the base commander, had called an emergency assembly for all personnel, and the tension in the main auditorium was palpable as soldiers filed in with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. Colonel Stone was a no-nonsense officer with 25 years of service and a reputation for direct communication. She'd commanded Camp Iron Ridge for 2 years, transforming it from a mediocre training facility into one of the Army's premier advanced tactical schools. Her success had earned her the attention of Pentagon leadership, but it had also placed enormous pressure on her to maintain the highest possible standards. "Ladies and gentlemen," Stone began, her voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium, "I've received notification from the Pentagon that Camp Iron Ridge has been selected for a comprehensive operational readiness evaluation. This assessment will determine whether our facility continues to receive advanced training missions or whether those responsibilities are transferred to other installations." The announcement sent a ripple of concerned murmurs through the assembled personnel. Everyone understood the implications. Failure would mean reassignments, budget cuts, and the potential closure of programs that defined the base's mission. Their own career prospects, Stone continued with characteristic directness. "The evaluation will be conducted by a team of senior officers from the Pentagon Special Operations Command, including General Patricia Wells, who serves as the Deputy Director of Special Operations Training. They will be observing a comprehensive field exercise designed to test our personnel's ability to plan and execute complex multi-unit operations under realistic combat conditions." Jessica felt her blood turn cold at the mention of General Wells. She knew that name intimately. Patricia Wells had been the theater commander who'd authorized Operation Nightfall and personally debriefed Jessica after David Park's death. If Wells was coming to Camp Iron Ridge. There was a significant possibility that she would recognize Jessica, despite the administrative role she'd adopted. "The exercise will be conducted in 3 weeks," Stone announced. "We will be evaluated on tactical planning, operational execution, leadership effectiveness, and our ability to train personnel for high-risk deployment scenarios. The scenario will involve a multi-phase operation requiring coordination between multiple units, complex communication protocols, and adaptive problem-solving under pressure." Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood stood to address the assembly, his demeanor radiating the kind of aggressive confidence that Jessica had learned to associate with officers who'd never been truly tested. "This is an opportunity for Camp Iron Ridge to demonstrate why we're considered one of the Army's premier training facilities. Our instructional staff has the experience and expertise necessary to design and execute an exercise that will exceed Pentagon expectations." Jessica listened to Blackwood's proclamation with growing alarm. Based on what she'd observed during recent training exercises, the instructional staff was fundamentally unprepared for the kind of evaluation General Wells would conduct. The communication failures, coordination problems, and tactical deficiencies she'd witnessed would be immediately apparent to someone with Wells' background and experience. "All personnel will participate in this exercise according to their assigned specialties," Stone continued. "Administrative staff will provide logistical support and documentation, while operational personnel will demonstrate the tactical competencies that justify our mission and funding." The phrase "administrative staff" hit Jessica like a physical blow. She was being relegated once again to the sidelines, assigned to carry clipboards and document the failures of others, while possessing the exact expertise that could ensure the exercise's success. The irony was devastating. The evaluation that would determine the base's future would be conducted without input from the one person present who had the experience to meet General Wells' standards. After the assembly, Jessica overheard conversations that confirmed her worst fears about how the exercise would unfold. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood was already planning an operation that prioritized impressive-looking tactics over practical effectiveness, while Major Chun was expressing concerns about communication protocols that she lacked the experience to resolve. "We need something that looks challenging but doesn't actually put anyone at risk," Blackwood was explaining to his senior staff. "The Pentagon observers want to see competence and professionalism, not necessarily innovation or complexity." It was exactly the wrong approach. Jessica knew from personal experience that General Wells was far more interested in practical effectiveness and visual spectacle. The kind of exercise Blackwood was describing would impress civilian observers but would immediately reveal to someone with Wells' background that the instructional staff didn't understand the realities of special operations. Sergeant First Class Mason approached the group with his usual swagger. "Sir, whatever we plan, we need to make sure it's something we can actually execute. No point in designing something too complicated for our people to handle." The comment revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what the evaluation was designed to assess. Wells wasn't coming to observe routine training exercises. She was evaluating whether Camp Iron Ridge could prepare personnel for the kind of complex, high-risk operations that defined modern special operations. Mason's emphasis on keeping things simple was exactly what would convince Pentagon leadership that the facility wasn't meeting its mission requirements. Jessica wanted to interrupt, to explain that their approach was guaranteed to fail, but she knew that any attempt to contribute would be dismissed as presumptuous interference from someone whose qualifications they'd already judged inadequate. The frustration was overwhelming. She was watching her colleagues plan for a disaster that she could easily prevent, but her self-imposed anonymity made intervention impossible. That afternoon, Jessica was assigned to assist with preliminary planning for the exercise, which meant taking notes during meetings where fundamentally flawed concepts were being developed with complete confidence. She sat in the back of Conference Room B, documenting discussions that revealed just how unprepared her colleagues were for the kind of scrutiny they were about to face. "The scenario should involve a hostage rescue," suggested Captain Rodriguez. "That's always impressive, and it gives us opportunities to demonstrate multiple skill sets." "Good idea," Blackwood agreed. "We can set up a mock compound in the training area and have teams practice breaching techniques." Jessica nearly choked on her coffee. Hostage rescue operations were among the most complex and dangerous missions in special operations, requiring months of specialized training and perfect coordination between multiple elements. The casual way her colleagues were discussing it revealed that they had no understanding of what such operations actually entailed. Major Chun raised practical concerns. "Sir, do we have personnel qualified to teach advanced breaching techniques? And what about the communication protocols for coordinating multiple teams in confined spaces?" "We'll figure it out," Blackwood replied dismissively. "How complicated can it be? Our people are professionals. They'll adapt." The response was exactly what Jessica had expected and exactly what would convince General Wells that Camp Iron Ridge was fundamentally unfit for its mission. Professional soldiers didn't figure out hostage rescue operations. They trained extensively, planned meticulously, and executed with precision that came from understanding that mistakes meant innocent people died. As the meeting continued, Jessica realized that she was facing an impossible choice. She could maintain her anonymity and watch her colleagues design an exercise that would destroy their careers and close the facility, or she could reveal her background and risk exposing the very experiences she'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The decision became more pressing when Master Sergeant Torres approached her after the meeting. His expression was serious, and Jessica sensed that their earlier conversation was about to continue in ways she wasn't prepared for. "Ma'am, can we talk privately?" Torres asked quietly. They walked to an empty conference room, and Torres closed the door before speaking. "Captain Kane, I've been doing some thinking about our conversation the other night, and I've got some concerns about this upcoming exercise." Jessica felt her defenses rising automatically. "What kind of concerns, Sergeant?" "The kind that come from watching people plan for something they don't understand," Torres replied bluntly. "Ma'am, I've worked with special operations units. I know what General Wells is going to be looking for, and what I saw in that meeting isn't going to impress her." He paused, studying Jessica's face carefully. "But I also know that you were listening to that discussion like someone who understood exactly what was wrong with it. That's not the reaction of someone whose military experience is limited to PowerPoint presentations." Jessica felt the walls of her carefully constructed identity beginning to crumble. Torres wasn't making accusations, but his observations were becoming impossible to deflect, and the approaching evaluation was forcing her to confront the reality that her silence might have consequences far beyond her own career. "Sergeant Torres," she said carefully, "I appreciate your confidence, but I think you're overestimating my knowledge." Torres smiled grimly. "Ma'am, with respect, I think the problem is that everyone else is underestimating it. The question is whether you're going to let them fail because you're afraid to show them what you really know." The challenge was direct and impossible to ignore. Jessica realized that Torres had reached the same conclusion she'd been avoiding, that her self-imposed exile was no longer protecting anyone, and that the approaching evaluation would force her to choose between maintaining her anonymity and preventing a disaster that would affect everyone on the base. Outside the conference room window, she could see soldiers preparing for another day of training, unaware that their futures depended on an exercise that was being planned by people who lacked the experience to ensure its success. The weight of responsibility she'd been trying to escape for 3 years was settling on her shoulders once again, but this time, running away wasn't an option. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of increasingly frantic preparation as Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood and his staff attempted to design an exercise that would impress Pentagon observers while remaining within the limits of their actual capabilities. Jessica found herself attending daily planning meetings where she was expected to document decisions that made her more anxious. With each passing day, the exercise scenario had evolved into something that bore little resemblance to actual special operations but looked impressive on paper. Blackwood had settled on a compound assault involving 3 separate teams: an assault element that would breach the main building, a support element that would provide overwatch and covering fire, and a command element that would coordinate the operation from a nearby hilltop. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable training exercise. But Jessica could see fundamental flaws in the planning that would become catastrophic failures under the kind of scrutiny General Wells would provide. The communication protocols were unnecessarily complex. The coordination procedures were based on theoretical knowledge rather than practical experience, and the timeline was far too aggressive for teams that had never worked together in this type of operation. The assault element will have 12 minutes from initial breach to hostage extraction, Blackwood announced during one planning session, pointing to a detailed timeline displayed on the conference room wall. Support element will maintain overwatch positions and provide covering fire as needed. Command element will coordinate with simulated air support and manage communication with higher headquarters. Major Chun raised her hand tentatively. Sir, 12 minutes seems optimistic for a hostage rescue. What if the teams encounter unexpected resistance, or if there are complications with the hostages? That's why we're training, Blackwood replied dismissively. Professional soldiers adapt to changing circumstances. If they can't complete the mission in the allocated time, they need better training. Jessica bit her tongue to prevent herself from explaining that hostage rescue operations were planned with extensive contingencies, precisely because adapting to changing circumstances usually meant innocent people died. The timeline Blackwood had established was based on perfect execution under ideal conditions, exactly the kind of planning that led to mission failure in real operations. The communication plan was even more problematic. Major Chun had designed a system that required teams to report their status every 2 minutes, while maintaining operational security and coordinating with multiple command elements. It sounded professional and thorough, but Jessica knew from experience that the frequency of required communications would actually compromise operational security while providing minimal useful information. Each team leader will provide detailed status reports using the standardized format, Chun explained, distributing laminated cards showing the required communication procedures. This will ensure that command maintains full situational awareness throughout the operation. Sergeant First Class Mason studied the communication card with obvious confusion. Ma'am, this seems like a lot of radio chatter for a stealth operation. Won't all these status reports make it pretty obvious to anyone listening that we're conducting an assault? The exercise scenario assumes that we have secure communications, Chun replied. In real operations, our radio traffic would be encrypted and undetectable by enemy forces. Jessica wanted to laugh at the naive assumption, but the humor was overshadowed by her growing alarm at how unprepared her colleagues were for the evaluation they were about to face. General Wells had conducted actual hostage rescue operations where communication security was a matter of life and death. She would immediately recognize that the communication plan was designed by someone who'd never had to worry about enemy intercepts or electronic warfare. The tactical plan was equally flawed. Captain Rodriguez had been assigned to lead the assault element, and his briefings revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how building clearance operations actually worked. He was planning to breach multiple entry points simultaneously and have his teams converge on the hostage location, apparently unaware that such tactics dramatically increased the risk of friendly fire incidents. We'll hit them from 3 directions at once, Rodriguez explained enthusiastically, using toy soldiers to demonstrate his plan on a tabletop model of the compound. They won't know which way to respond, and we'll have the hostages out before they can react. What about identification? Procedures? Asked Staff Sergeant Williams, one of the more experienced NCOs. How do we make sure our teams don't mistake each other for enemy forces when they're moving through the building? Rodriguez waved off the concern. Everyone knows their assigned sectors. As long as people stay in their lanes, there won't be any confusion. Jessica closed her eyes and tried not to think about the dozens of training accidents she'd investigated that began with exactly that kind of overconfident assumption. Building clearance operations required extensive rehearsal and detailed coordination precisely because even experienced teams could become confused in the stress and complexity of close-quarters combat. Master Sergeant Torres caught her expression during Rodriguez's briefing and approached her afterward with obvious concerns of his own. "Ma'am, can I ask you something off the record?" They stepped into an empty hallway, and Torres spoke quietly to avoid being overheard. "That tactical plan Rodriguez is developing, does it seem sound to you?" Jessica chose her words carefully. "I think there are some areas that might benefit from additional consideration, such as?" The question put her in an impossible position. She could provide generic observations that wouldn't reveal her background, but Torres was clearly hoping for more specific guidance. And the truth was that Rodriguez's plan contained so many fundamental errors that it would be dangerous even as a training exercise. "Coordination in confined spaces is always challenging," she said finally. "Clear identification procedures are essential to prevent accidents." Torres studied her face intently. "Ma'am, you're talking like someone who's actually dealt with these challenges before." "That's not theoretical knowledge, that's practical experience." Before Jessica could respond, Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood appeared at the end of the hallway and called out to them, "Torres, Kane, we need you in the conference room. The Pentagon observers are arriving tomorrow instead of next week." The announcement hit Jessica like a physical blow. General Wells was coming tomorrow, which meant there was no time to correct the fundamental problems with the exercise plan. Her colleagues were about to conduct a training operation that would expose their inexperience in front of someone who had the authority to destroy their careers and close the facility. As they walked back to the conference room, Torres spoke, quietly enough that only Jessica could hear. "Ma'am, I don't know what your story is, but I'm starting to think we're going to need all the help we can get tomorrow. If you've got experience that could prevent this from being a complete disaster, maybe it's time to stop hiding it." The conference room buzzed with nervous energy as the staff tried to finalize preparations for an evaluation that was now less than 24 hours away. Jessica took her usual position at the back of the room, but for the first time in 3 years, she found herself mentally evaluating the exercise plan not as a passive observer, but as someone who might need to intervene. The communication protocols could be simplified to reduce radio chatter while maintaining necessary coordination. The tactical plan could be modified to include proper identification procedures and safer movement techniques. The timeline could be adjusted to account for realistic complications rather than assuming perfect execution, but making those changes would require revealing knowledge that would immediately raise questions about her background. General Wells wasn't just any Pentagon observer. She was someone who would instantly recognize the source of Jessica's expertise and potentially expose the very experiences Jessica had spent 3 years trying to forget. Colonel Stone entered the conference room with an expression that suggested the pressure from higher headquarters was becoming intense. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just spoken with General Wells' advance team. They've moved up the evaluation timeline due to schedule conflicts. The exercise will be conducted tomorrow morning, with observers arriving at 0700 hours. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. They had less than 18 hours to finalize preparations for an evaluation that would determine the future of their careers and their facility. "Sir," Major Chun said hesitantly, We haven't had time to conduct full rehearsals with all elements. Are you sure we're ready for this level of scrutiny? Stone's response revealed just how much pressure she was under from Pentagon leadership. We'll be ready because we have to be ready. Failure isn't an option. As the meeting broke up and staff members scattered to make final preparations, Jessica remained in her chair, staring at the tactical diagrams and communication plans spread across the conference table. Tomorrow morning, General Wells would arrive expecting to observe a demonstration of advanced tactical training. Instead, she would witness an exercise planned by well-meaning but inexperienced officers who were about to expose their limitations in front of someone with the authority to end their careers. The question that had been haunting Jessica for weeks now demanded an immediate answer. Was she going to maintain her anonymity and watch her colleagues fail? Or was she finally going to accept the responsibility that came with her knowledge and experience? Outside the conference room window, the sun was setting over the Arizona desert, casting long shadows across the training areas where tomorrow's disaster would unfold. In less than 12 hours, General Patricia Wells would arrive at Camp Iron Ridge, and Jessica would be forced to choose between the safety of her carefully constructed identity and the welfare of soldiers who deserved better than the training they were about to receive. The morning of the evaluation dawned clear and mercilessly hot, with the kind of desert sun that would make every mistake more painful and every failure more obvious. Jessica arrived at the command post before sunrise, as had become her habit. But today the familiar routine felt like preparation for an execution rather than another day of administrative duties. General Patricia Wells and her evaluation team had arrived at 0630 hours in a convoy of black SUVs that screamed Pentagon authority. Jessica watched from the command post window as Wells stepped out of the lead vehicle, immediately recognizable despite the 3 years that had passed since their last meeting. She was still tall and imposing, with silver hair and the kind of bearing that commanded instant respect from everyone around her. Jessica's stomach clenched with anxiety as she remembered their final conversation after Operation Nightfall. Wells had been sympathetic but direct about the realities of command responsibility, explaining that good leaders sometimes had to make decisions that cost lives in order to save more lives. At the time, Jessica had thought she understood what Wells meant, but the guilt over David Park's death had proven stronger than her intellectual acceptance of command necessity. Now, Wells was here to evaluate a training facility where Jessica held a position so far beneath her actual capabilities that it bordered on the absurd. If Wells recognized her, the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected Jessica for 3 years would be destroyed in an instant. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood greeted the evaluation team with his usual aggressive confidence, apparently unaware that his swagger was exactly the wrong approach to take with someone of Wells' experience and authority. Jessica could see Wells' expression shift almost imperceptibly as Blackwood launched into a rehearsed speech about the excellence of Camp Iron Ridge's training programs. General Wells, it's an honor to have you here to observe what we believe is the finest advanced tactical training in the Army, Blackwood declared. Our instructional staff has designed an exercise that will demonstrate the kind of competence and professionalism that defines this facility. Wells nodded politely, but Jessica could see the skepticism in her eyes. In Jessica's experience, truly competent officers didn't need to proclaim their competence. They demonstrated it through their work. Blackwood's opening statement had already marked him as someone who was more concerned with appearances than substance. The exercise briefing was conducted in the main conference room, with Jessica relegated to her usual position in the back with her clipboard and administrative materials. She watched Wells' face carefully as Major Chun explained the communication protocols. Captain Rodriguez outlined the tactical plan, and Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood presented the timeline that would govern the entire operation. Wells asked few questions during the briefing, but Jessica could see her taking detailed notes, and occasionally exchanging glances with her evaluation team members. The questions she did ask were precise and revealing, focusing on exactly the areas where the planning was weakest. "Captain Rodriguez," Wells said quietly, "you mentioned simultaneous breach from 3 entry points. How are you planning to prevent fratricide incidents when your teams converge in the central area?" Rodriguez's response revealed his fundamental inexperience. "Ma'am, we've assigned clear sectors to each team. As long as everyone stays in their designated areas, there shouldn't be any confusion." Wells' expression didn't change, but Jessica saw her make another note. Anyone with actual building clearance experience knew that sector assignments were meaningless once teams started moving through complex interior spaces under stress. Rodriguez's answer had just confirmed that he'd never conducted this type of operation under realistic conditions. "Major Chun," Wells continued, "your communication plan requires status reports every 2 minutes. How does that requirement balance against operational security considerations?" Chun's answer was even more revealing. "Ma'am, the exercise scenario assumes secure communications, so operational security isn't a primary concern." Jessica wanted to bury her face in her hands. Chun had just told one of the Pentagon's senior special operations officers that she'd never planned an operation where enemy interception was a realistic threat. Wells was undoubtedly beginning to understand that she was observing officers who lacked the practical experience necessary for the advanced training mission they'd been assigned. The actual exercise began at 0900 hours, and the problems Jessica had anticipated started immediately. The assault teams moved to their positions with the kind of obvious coordination that would have been visible to any enemy force within miles. The communication plan that had seemed manageable in the conference room became chaotic when implemented by teams operating under time pressure. Jessica monitored the radio traffic from her position in the command post, listening to increasingly frantic transmissions as the exercise timeline began to fall apart. Teams were missing their assigned checkpoints, communication protocols were being abandoned under pressure, and the careful coordination that had been planned was dissolving into improvised chaos. "Bravo team, this is command. You're 3 minutes behind schedule. Accelerate your approach to the target building." "Command, Bravo team. We're encountering unexpected obstacles in our approach route. Request permission to modify our timeline." "Negative, Bravo team. Maintain original timeline. Charlie team is depending on your coordination." Jessica recognized the conversation pattern immediately. Commanders pushing subordinates to maintain unrealistic schedules while ignoring practical complications. It was exactly the kind of inflexible thinking that led to mission failures and unnecessary casualties. Wells was monitoring the same radio traffic from her position on the observation deck, and Jessica could see her expression growing more grim with each confused transmission. The evaluation team was witnessing a demonstration not of competence, but of the kind of planning and execution that would be catastrophic in actual operations. The breaking point came when Captain Rodriguez's assault team attempted their coordinated breach of the target building. The simultaneous entry from 3 directions created exactly the kind of confusion Jessica had anticipated, with teams becoming disoriented in the building's interior and losing track of their assigned sectors. "Alpha team, where are you? We're not seeing you in Sector 2. Charlie team, be advised we have movement in your area. Can you confirm your position? All teams, we have a possible friendly fire situation. Cease movement and report positions immediately." The exercise came to an abrupt halt as safety officers intervened to prevent what could have become a serious training accident. Rodriguez's teams were pulled back to regroup, but the damage to the unit's credibility was already complete. Wells had just witnessed a demonstration that the instructional staff at Camp Iron Ridge lacked the experience and competence necessary for advanced tactical training. "Lieutenant, Colonel Blackwood tried to salvage the situation with explanations about the complexity of the exercise and the learning opportunities presented by challenging scenarios, but Jessica could see that Wells wasn't buying his justifications. The general had observed enough real operations to recognize the difference between realistic training challenges and fundamental planning failures. During the post-exercise debriefing, Wells' questions became more pointed and more revealing of the evaluation team's conclusions. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, how many of your instructional staff have conducted actual hostage rescue operations? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Blackwood's answer confirmed what Wells already suspected. Ma'am, our staff brings a diverse range of conventional military experience to their instructional duties. It was a careful non-answer that admitted that none of the senior instructors had the specialized experience necessary for the training they were supposedly providing. Wells had just confirmed that Camp Iron Ridge was attempting to teach advanced special operations techniques using instructors whose knowledge was theoretical rather than practical. Jessica sat in the back of the debriefing room, watching her colleagues' careers implode in real time. The exercise had been exactly the disaster she'd anticipated, and Wells' evaluation would undoubtedly recommend significant changes to the facility's mission and staffing. Soldiers who had served competently within their actual areas of expertise were about to be penalized for attempting to perform duties they weren't qualified for. Master, Sergeant Torres caught her eye from across the room, his expression clearly asking the question that had been haunting their conversations for weeks. Was she going to continue hiding her qualifications while watching her colleagues fail? The answer was becoming unavoidable. Jessica possessed exactly the experience and knowledge that could have prevented the morning's disasters, but her self-imposed anonymity had made her complicit in failures that would affect the careers and futures of everyone on the base. As Wells prepared to conclude the evaluation with what would obviously be a devastating assessment of the facility's capabilities, Jessica realized that her 3-year exile was about to end. The question was whether she had the courage to reclaim the identity she'd spent so long trying to forget, and whether she could find a way to honor David Park's memory by ensuring that his sacrifice had taught her lessons worth sharing. The PowerPoint girl was about to disappear forever, but Jessica wasn't sure she was ready for the return of Viper 7's commander. The debriefing room fell into uncomfortable silence as General Wells closed her evaluation folder and prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be a devastating assessment. Jessica watched from her position in the back of the room, her hands clenched tightly around her clipboard as she faced the moment she'd been dreading for 3 years. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, Wells began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that Jessica remembered so well. I've observed exercises at facilities throughout the Army, and I need to be direct about what I witnessed here today. Blackwood straightened in his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious anxiety. Yes, ma'am. We're always eager to receive feedback on our training programs. Wells' response was precise and unforgiving. What I observed was not an advanced tactical training exercise. It was a demonstration of why theoretical knowledge cannot substitute for practical experience in special operations instruction. The words hit the room like a physical blow. Jessica could see the color drain from Blackwood's face as he realized that his career was about to be destroyed by someone whose authority was absolute and whose judgment would be accepted without question by Pentagon leadership. The communication protocols were unnecessarily complex and operationally unsound, Wells continued methodically. The tactical plan violated basic principles of building clearance operations. The timeline was unrealistic and potentially dangerous. Most significantly, none of your instructional staff demonstrated the practical experience necessary to prepare soldiers for the realities of special operations. Major Chun raised her hand tentatively. Ma'am, we followed established doctrine and incorporated lessons learned from previous exercises. Major, Wells interrupted gently but firmly. Doctrine is written by people who have conducted these Operations under combat conditions. Following doctrine requires understanding why those procedures exist, not simply memorizing the steps. What I observed today was checkbox training that would get people killed in actual operations. Jessica felt something break inside her chest as she listened to Wells deliver the same kind of assessment she'd wanted to provide for months. Every criticism was accurate. Every observation was based on the practical experience that Jessica possessed but had been too afraid to share. Sergeant First Class Mason, apparently unable to read the room's obvious tension, chose that moment to speak up with characteristic arrogance. "General, with respect, we've been conducting successful training exercises for months. Today's complications were unusual and don't represent our normal standards." Wells turned her attention to Mason with the kind of focus that Jessica remembered from operational briefings where lives hung in the balance. "Sergeant, what's your personal experience with hostage rescue?" "Operations?" The question was simple and direct, but Mason's answer revealed everything. "Ma'am, I've participated in numerous training exercises and studied the relevant doctrine extensively." "That wasn't my question," Wells replied quietly. "I asked about your operational experience. Have you ever conducted an actual hostage rescue?" Mason's silence was answer enough, and Wells continued with the methodical precision that had made her legendary in special operations circles. "Have any of your instructors conducted actual hostage rescue operations? Have any of them planned and executed building clearance operations under combat conditions? Have any of them managed communication protocols during multi-unit special operations?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, each one highlighting the fundamental gap between the training camp iron Ridge was supposed to provide and the qualifications of the people providing it. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood tried to salvage the situation. "Ma'am, our instructors bring diverse conventional military experience." "Conventional military experience," Wells interrupted, "is not sufficient for special operations training. You cannot teach what you have not learned, and you cannot prepare soldiers for experiences you have never had." Jessica could feel Master Sergeant Torres watching her from across the room, his expression clearly communicating what he'd been trying to tell her for weeks. This was the moment when her knowledge and experience were desperately needed, and continued silence was no longer an option. The weight of responsibility that Jessica had been trying to escape for 3 years settled on her shoulders with crushing finality. She thought about David Park and the promise she'd made to honor his memory by helping other soldiers avoid the same fate. She thought about the young soldiers who would be deployed to dangerous assignments after receiving inadequate training from well-meaning but inexperienced instructors. Most importantly, she thought about the conversation she'd had with Wells 3 years ago, when the general had explained that leadership meant accepting responsibility for difficult decisions and living with the consequences. Jessica had spent 3 years running from that responsibility, but the disaster unfolding in front of her was forcing her to confront the truth she'd been avoiding. Her silence wasn't protecting anyone, it was contributing to the very problems she'd hoped to prevent. Jessica stood up slowly, her movement drawing attention from everyone in the room. For a moment, she hesitated, knowing that her next words would destroy the carefully constructed anonymity that had protected her for 3 years. "General Wells," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silent room, "I believe I can address some of your concerns." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jessica saw Wells' head turn sharply in her direction. For a moment, recognition flickered across the general's face, followed by confusion and then dawning understanding. "Captain Kane," Wells said, slowly, studying Jessica's face with growing intensity. "Do we know each other?" The question was the one Jessica had been dreading, but also the one that would finally allow her to stop hiding from who she really was. She took a deep breath and gave the answer that would change everything. "Yes, ma'am. We worked together on Operation Nightfall in Afghanistan. You knew me as the commander of Viper 7. The room erupted in shocked murmurs as Jessica's colleagues tried to process what they'd just heard. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood's mouth fell open. Sergeant First Class Mason looked like he'd been slapped, and Major Chun stared at Jessica as if she'd never seen her before. But Jessica's attention was focused entirely on General Wells, whose expression had shifted from confusion to recognition to something that might have been relief. "Captain Jessica Kane," Wells said slowly. "Call sign Viper 7, one of the most decorated special operations commanders in modern military history." The words hit the room like a bomb, and Jessica could see her colleagues struggling to reconcile the PowerPoint girl they'd dismissed and humiliated for months with the legendary commander that General Wells was describing. Wells stood and walked across the room until she was standing directly in front of Jessica, her expression combining respect with something that looked like concern. "Captain Kane," Wells said quietly, "what are you doing here?" The question was gentle but pointed, and Jessica realized that Wells understood exactly why someone with her background and qualifications had ended up in such a diminished role. The general had probably seen other talented officers destroyed by the guilt and trauma that came with command responsibility. "I requested reassignment to training duties after Operation Nightfall," Jessica replied simply. "I wanted to help prepare other soldiers for the challenges they would face." Wells nodded slowly, understanding immediately the grief and guilt that had driven Jessica's decision. "And have you been able to do that here?" The question forced Jessica to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for months. "No, ma'am, I haven't. Why not?" Jessica glanced around the room at her colleagues, who were still staring at her in shock and disbelief. "Because I chose to hide my background rather than use it to help others." Wells' response was the same kind of direct challenge that Jessica remembered from their previous conversations. "And what are you going to choose now?" The question demanded an immediate answer, and Jessica realized that her 3-year exile was finally over. She could continue hiding behind her administrative role while watching inadequate training put soldiers at risk, or she could reclaim the identity and responsibility she'd spent so long trying to escape. Looking directly at General Wells, Jessica gave the answer that would define the rest of her career. "I choose to help." The PowerPoint girl was dead. Viper 7 had returned to service. The silence that followed Jessica's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. General Wells studied her face with the intensity of someone confirming a ghost had suddenly materialized in front of her, while the rest of the room struggled to process the impossible transformation they'd just witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Wells announced, her voice cutting through the stunned quiet, "you have been working alongside one of the most accomplished special operations commanders in modern military history." She turned to face the assembled staff, her expression carrying the kind of authority that made every word feel like a formal pronouncement. "Captain Jessica Kane, call sign Viper 7, commanded one of our most elite special operations units for 4 years. Her operational record includes successful completion of 47 classified missions across 4 continents." Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood's face had gone completely pale, and Jessica could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd dismissed as incompetent with the legendary commander Wells was describing. "General, we had no idea about Captain Kane's background." "That's precisely the problem," Wells replied with quiet intensity. "You had one of the Army's most experienced special operations officers on your staff, and instead of utilizing her expertise, you relegated her to administrative duties and allowed her to be treated with disrespect by personnel with a fraction of her qualifications." Jessica watched Sergeant First Class Mason's face cycle through confusion, embarrassment, and dawning horror as he realized the implications of his months of dismissive comments and mocking behavior. The PowerPoint girl he'd been ridiculing was someone whose operational achievements he couldn't even imagine. Major Chun raised her hand tentatively, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, how are we supposed to know?" Her file showed no Special Operations Background. Wells' response revealed the depth of the institutional failure that had created this situation. Major. Competent officers recognize expertise regardless of what appears in official files. Captain Kane's knowledge, bearing, and professional competence should have been obvious to anyone with the experience to evaluate them properly. The criticism hit home with devastating accuracy. Jessica had demonstrated her expertise repeatedly during training exercises and planning sessions, but her colleagues had been too arrogant and inexperienced to recognize what they were seeing. General. Wells continued with the methodical precision that Jessica remembered from operational briefings. Captain Kane's unit holds the record for successful hostage rescue operations. They pioneered communication protocols that are now standard throughout special operations. Their tactical innovations saved hundreds of lives and prevented dozens of international incidents. Jessica felt uncomfortable with the praise, but she recognized that Wells was making a point that went beyond her individual achievements. The general was demonstrating that real competence was recognizable to people who knew what to look for, and that the staff's failure to identify Jessica's capabilities revealed their own limitations. The exercise you conducted this morning, Wells continued, contained fundamental errors that Captain Kane could have corrected in minutes. The communication failures you experienced were exactly the kind of problems her unit solved years ago. The tactical mistakes that nearly resulted in a training accident were issues she addressed in actual combat operations. Captain Rodriguez found his voice, though it carried none of his usual confidence. "Ma'am, if Captain Kane had this level of experience, why didn't she correct our planning?" It was exactly the question Jessica had been expecting, and Wells' response demonstrated her understanding of the complex emotions that had driven Jessica's decision to hide her background. "Captain Rodriguez, that's a question you should ask Captain Kane directly. But I suspect you'll find that officers who have commanded at her level sometimes struggle with the transition to environments where their expertise isn't recognized or valued." Jessica appreciated Wells' diplomatic phrasing, but she knew that a more complete explanation was necessary. Her colleagues deserved to understand why she'd chosen silence over the kind of leadership they desperately needed. "General Wells is correct," Jessica said quietly, addressing the room directly for the first time since her revelation. "I chose to hide my background because I was dealing with guilt over decisions I made as a commander. I thought that stepping away from operational responsibilities would help me avoid making choices that could cost lives." She paused, looking around the room at faces that showed mixtures of shock, embarrassment, and growing respect. "But what I realized this morning is that my silence was contributing to exactly the kind of problems that get soldiers killed. You deserved better guidance than I was providing." Master Sergeant Torres spoke for the first time since the revelation began, his voice carrying obvious admiration. "Ma'am, some of us suspected you had more experience than your assignment suggested. The way you handled equipment, your understanding of tactical concepts, your bearing it all pointed to someone with serious operational background." His comment drew nods from several of the more experienced NCOs, and Jessica realized that her attempt at anonymity hadn't been as successful as she'd believed. The people with real military experience had recognized signs that she'd been displaying unconsciously. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood finally found his voice, though it carried none of the arrogance that had characterized his previous interactions. "With Jessica, Captain Kane, I owe you an apology. My treatment of you was completely inappropriate, and I failed in my responsibility to recognize and utilize your expertise." The apology was formal and sincere, but Jessica could see that Blackwood was struggling with more than just embarrassment. His entire understanding of military competence and leadership had been shattered by the revelation that he'd been dismissing someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own. "Lieutenant Colonel," Jessica replied carefully, "your treatment of me reflected the information you had available, but it also reflected assumptions about competence that may need reconsideration." General Wells stepped forward, bringing the focus back to the institutional issues that had created this situation. The question now is how to move forward. Captain Kane, are you willing to take on the responsibilities that match your qualifications? The question was both an offer and a challenge. Jessica could return to administrative duties and maintain the safe anonymity she'd cultivated, or she could accept the kind of leadership role that would require her to make the difficult decisions she'd been avoiding for 3 years, she thought. About David Park and the conversation they'd had before Operation Nightfall, when he'd expressed concerns about the intelligence they'd received. She thought about the promise she'd made to honor his memory by helping other soldiers receive better preparation for the dangers they would face. Most importantly, she thought about the young soldiers who would be deployed to hostile environments. After receiving training from instructors who lacked the experience to prepare them properly, her silence over the past 3 years had been a form of abandoning those soldiers, and she couldn't continue to hide from that responsibility. "Yes, ma'am," Jessica said firmly. "I'm ready to take on those responsibilities." Wells nodded with obvious satisfaction. "Excellent. Your first assignment will be to redesign the training programs at this facility to reflect actual special operations requirements. You'll have complete authority to modify curricula, select qualified instructors, and establish standards that will properly prepare soldiers for advanced deployment scenarios." The assignment was exactly what Jessica had wanted to do when she'd first requested transfer to training duties, but it was also exactly the kind of responsibility she'd been afraid to accept. Leading a training program meant making decisions that would affect the lives and careers of hundreds of soldiers, and those decisions would require the same kind of courage that had once made her an effective operational commander. As the debriefing concluded and people began to file out of the room, Jessica realized that her 3-year exile was truly over. The PowerPoint girl who had hidden behind administrative duties was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to accept the responsibilities that came with her knowledge and experience. But the real test would come in the following days and weeks, as she worked to rebuild training programs while confronting the guilt and fear that had driven her into hiding. The revelation of her identity was just the beginning. The real challenge would be proving that Viper 7's commander could still lead effectively despite the failures that had haunted her for 3 years. The hours following Jessica's revelation brought a series of conversations that she'd never imagined having when she'd first arrived at Camp Iron Ridge 3 years earlier. Her small quarters, which had once been a refuge from the daily humiliations of her administrative role, became a destination for colleagues seeking to understand how they'd so completely misjudged someone they'd worked alongside for months. The first visitor was Major Chun, who knocked hesitantly on Jessica's door shortly after the debriefing concluded. When Jessica opened it, she found the communications officer standing in the hallway with an expression that combined embarrassment, curiosity, and what might have been genuine remorse. "Ma'am," Chun began, her usual confidence replaced by obvious uncertainty, "I wanted to apologize for my behavior during the communication planning sessions." "If I'd known about your background—" "Major," Jessica interrupted gently, "you don't need to apologize for not knowing information that I deliberately concealed. But you might want to consider why you were so quick to dismiss advice from someone whose qualifications you hadn't bothered to verify." The observation was delivered without malice, but Jessica could see it hit home. Chun had spent months assuming that her theoretical knowledge of communication protocols was superior to Jessica's practical suggestions, never considering that her dismissive attitude might be preventing her from learning from someone with actual operational experience. "Ma'am, looking back on our conversations, I realize that your recommendations were consistently more sophisticated than what I was proposing. You were trying to teach me things I was too arrogant to recognize." Jessica nodded, appreciating Chun's honesty while also recognizing an opportunity to address broader issues that had contributed to the training failures they'd all witnessed. "Major, the problem wasn't your lack of knowledge, It was your assumption that competence could be judged by rank and assignment rather than by demonstrated expertise. That assumption is dangerous in training environments and potentially catastrophic in operational settings. Shun absorbed the criticism with obvious discomfort, but Jessica could see that she was beginning to understand the deeper implications of what had occurred at Camp Iron Ridge. Captain Rodriguez was the next to appear, his usual swagger completely absent as he struggled to reconcile the PowerPoint girl he'd dismissed with the legendary commander he'd just learned about. His conversation was more difficult because his tactical planning had contained the kind of fundamental errors that could have resulted in serious injuries during the exercise. "Captain Kane," he began, clearly struggling with how to address someone he'd been treating as an inferior for months. "I've been thinking about the tactical plan I developed for this morning's exercise. Given your experience, it must have been obvious that my approach was completely wrong." Jessica had been expecting this conversation, and she'd decided to use it as a teaching moment rather than an opportunity for recrimination. "Captain Rodriguez, your plan contains several issues that could have been addressed through consultation with someone who had practical building clearance experience. The question is whether you're interested in learning why those issues exist and how to correct them." Rodriguez nodded eagerly, and Jessica spent the next hour walking him through the fundamental principles of hostage rescue operations. She explained why simultaneous breach from multiple entry points created unacceptable friendly fire risks, how communication protocols needed to balance coordination with operational security, and why realistic timelines were essential for maintaining tactical flexibility. As they talked, Jessica realized that Rodriguez wasn't incompetent, he was simply inexperienced, and had never been exposed to the kind of advanced training that would have prepared him for the responsibilities he'd been assigned. His eagerness to learn reminded her of young officers she'd mentored during her operational career, and she found herself beginning to see possibilities for real improvement in the facility's training programs. The most difficult conversation came when Sergeant First Class Mason appeared at her door late in the evening, his usual arrogance replaced by obvious anxiety about the implications of his months of disrespectful behavior toward someone whose operational achievements far exceeded anything he could imagine. "Ma'am," Mason began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to apologize for the way I've treated you. The things I said, the assumptions I made, knowing what I know now, it's inexcusable." Jessica studied his face, seeing genuine remorse but also recognizing an opportunity to address the kind of toxic attitudes that had made the training environment so dysfunctional. "Sergeant Mason, your behavior toward me was a symptom of a larger problem, the assumption that someone's current assignment reflects their capabilities, and that disrespect is acceptable when directed at people you consider inferior." Mason winced at the direct criticism, but Jessica continued with the kind of firm guidance she'd once provided to subordinates who needed to understand the consequences of their actions. "The problem with that attitude is that it prevents you from learning from people who might have valuable knowledge to share. More importantly, it creates an environment where competence is judged by appearances rather than by actual expertise." She paused, allowing the criticism to sink in before offering a path forward. "The question now is whether you're willing to change your approach to evaluating and interacting with colleagues." Mason nodded earnestly, and Jessica could see that her revelation had forced him to confront assumptions about military competence that had governed his behavior for years. Master Sergeant Torres arrived last, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression that suggested this would be a different kind of conversation entirely. "Ma'am," he said as Jessica gestured him inside, "I have to admit, I suspected you had special operations background, but I never imagined it was at the level General Wells described." Jessica accepted the coffee gratefully, recognizing that Torres had been her only real ally during the months when everyone else had been dismissing her contributions. "Sergeant Torres, you were the only person here who consistently treated me with professional respect." That meant more to me than you probably realized. Torres smiled, but his expression remained serious. Ma'am, I need to ask you something. Why did you let it go on for so long? You had to know that the training programs here were inadequate, and you had the knowledge to fix them. Why didn't you speak up sooner? The question was one Jessica had been asking herself since the morning's revelation, and she realized that Torres deserved an honest answer about the guilt and fear that had driven her decision to hide her background. Sergeant, I was dealing with guilt over decisions I'd made as a commander that cost good people their lives. I thought that stepping away from operational responsibilities would help me avoid making choices that could lead to more casualties. She paused, remembering David Park and the promise she'd made to honor his memory through better training for other soldiers. But what I realized this morning is that my silence was contributing to exactly the kind of inadequate preparation that gets soldiers killed. I was so focused on avoiding responsibility for future failures that I was ignoring my responsibility for current failures. Torres nodded with understanding. Ma'am, command responsibility doesn't go away just because you change your assignment. Someone with your experience has an obligation to share that knowledge, regardless of what rank or position you hold. The observation was delivered with the kind of respectful directness that Jessica had always valued in experienced NCOs, and she recognized that Torres was articulating a truth she'd been avoiding for 3 years. You're absolutely right, Sergeant. And I intend to fulfill that obligation moving forward. As Torres left her quarters, Jessica sat alone with her thoughts, finally beginning to process the magnitude of what had occurred. Her carefully constructed anonymity was gone, but in its place was an opportunity to accomplish what she'd originally hoped to achieve when she'd requested transfer to training duties. The revelation of her identity was just the beginning. The real work would start tomorrow when she would begin the process of rebuilding Camp Iron Ridge's training programs to reflect the realities of modern special operations. It would require confronting the guilt and fear that had driven her into hiding, but it would also allow her to honor David Park's memory by ensuring that other soldiers received the preparation they deserved. For the first time in 3 years, Jessica felt like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The PowerPoint girl was truly dead, and Viper 7 was ready to serve again. 3 days after Jessica's revelation, General Wells requested a private meeting that would formalize the changes already set in motion by the disastrous exercise and its aftermath. Jessica arrived at the temporary command post Wells had established. In the base commander's conference room, finding the general reviewing thick files that contained what appeared to be comprehensive personnel evaluations. Captain Kane, Wells began without preamble, I've spent the past 72 hours conducting a thorough review of how this situation developed and what institutional changes are necessary to prevent similar failures in the future. Jessica took the offered seat, recognizing that this conversation would go far beyond her personal circumstances to address the broader problems that had allowed a decorated special operations commander to be marginalized for 3 years. General, I accept responsibility for my role in creating this situation. I should have been more direct about my background and more assertive about contributing to training development. Wells studied Jessica's face with the intensity that had made her legendary in special operations circles. Captain, while your decision to conceal your background contributed to this situation, the primary responsibility lies with leadership that failed to recognize and utilize available expertise. She opened one of the files on the table, revealing what appeared to be a detailed analysis of personnel assignments and training outcomes over the past 3 years. Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood has been reassigned to a staff position at Fort Leavenworth, where he'll complete an intensive leadership development program before being considered for future command assignments. His failure to recognize your capabilities and his tolerance for the disrespectful treatment you received are incompatible with effective military leadership. Jessica absorbed the information without comment, recognizing that Blackwood's reassignment was both necessary and appropriate, given the institutional failures that had occurred under his command. Major Chun will remain at Camp Iron Ridge as your deputy, but she complete additional training in advanced communication systems and special operations protocols. Her technical knowledge is solid, but she needs practical exposure to the realities of special operations communication requirements. The decision reflected Wells' understanding that Chun's failures had been educational rather than fundamental. She'd been operating beyond her experience level rather than demonstrating incompetence within her actual area of expertise. Captain Rodriguez will be transferred to the infantry school at Fort Moore, where he'll receive proper training in advanced tactical operations before being considered for instructional duties. His tactical planning revealed gaps in knowledge that cannot be addressed through brief remedial training. Jessica nodded, appreciating Wells' recognition that Rodriguez needed systematic education rather than just correction of specific errors. His eagerness to learn suggested that he could become an effective instructor with proper preparation. Sergeant First Class Mason will be reduced in rank to Staff Sergeant and reassigned to a conventional unit, where he can develop the professional maturity necessary for leadership responsibilities. His behavior toward you was unacceptable and reflects attitudes that are incompatible with special operations training environments. The demotion was severe but appropriate, and Jessica recognized that Mason's problems went beyond simple ignorance to include fundamental issues with professional respect and military bearing. Wells closed the personnel files and focused her attention directly on Jessica. Now, regarding your new responsibilities, you'll be promoted to Major and assigned as the Director of Advanced Tactical Training for Camp Iron Ridge. Your mandate will be to completely redesign the curriculum to reflect actual special operations requirements. The promotion was both recognition of Jessica's qualifications and acknowledgement that her new responsibilities required appropriate rank and authority. She would no longer be subject to dismissal by officers whose experience couldn't match her operational background. General, I'm honored by your confidence, but I need to address something that's been concerning me since my revelation. Wells gestured for her to continue, and Jessica took a deep breath before voicing the fear that had haunted her since accepting these new responsibilities. Ma'am, my last operational command ended with the death of my second-in-command and 2 other operators. I've been questioning whether my judgment can be trusted with responsibilities that could affect the lives and careers of other soldiers. The admission was painful but necessary, and Jessica could see Wells' expression soften with understanding and what might have been personal recognition of similar struggles. Major Kane, Wells said quietly, I've read the complete after-action report from Operation Nightfall. Your decisions during that mission were tactically sound and saved the lives of 6 hostages plus the majority of your team. Captain Park's death was the result of enemy action and incomplete intelligence, not command failure. She paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing with the kind of direct guidance that Jessica remembered from their previous conversations. Good commanders sometimes lose people despite making correct decisions. That's the burden of leadership, not evidence of incompetence. The question is whether you've learned from that experience in ways that will make you a more effective leader. Going forward, Jessica felt some of the guilt she'd been carrying for 3 years begin to lift as Wells articulated truths she'd been unable to accept on her own. I believe I have, ma'am, but I'm still concerned about making decisions that could put soldiers at risk. Wells' response carried the weight of decades of command experience. Major, every training decision you make will put soldiers at risk, either the risk of inadequate preparation or the risk of training accidents. Your job is to minimize both types of risk while maximizing training effectiveness. That requires exactly the kind of practical experience you possess. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from curriculum development to instructor selection to the Establishment of evaluation standards that would ensure meaningful preparation for deployed operations. Jessica found herself energized by the scope of the challenges ahead and by the opportunity to finally use her knowledge in ways that could make a real difference. As the meeting concluded, Wells offered one final observation that helped Jessica understand why her revelation had been so important. Major Kane, your experience over the past 3 years has given you something that many special operations officers lack: an understanding of how easily expertise can be overlooked, and how devastating institutional arrogance can be to effective training. She stood to leave, but turned back with a final comment. Use that understanding to build programs that recognize and develop competence wherever it exists, regardless of rank or assignment. The Army needs leaders who can identify and nurture talent, not just those who can follow established hierarchies. After Wells left, Jessica sat alone in the conference room, finally beginning to understand that her 3 years of exile hadn't been wasted time. They'd been preparation for responsibilities that required both operational expertise and institutional wisdom. The humiliation and dismissal she'd endured had taught her lessons about leadership and recognition that would make her more effective in her new role. Master Sergeant Torres knocked on the doorframe, interrupting her thoughts. "Ma'am, congratulations on the promotion. The facility needs the kind of leadership you can provide." Jessica smiled, recognizing that Torres had understood from the beginning what it had taken her 3 years to accept: that expertise carried responsibility regardless of assignment, and that hiding from that responsibility served no one. "Thank you, Sergeant. I'm looking forward to working with people who understand that competence comes in many forms, and that the best leaders are those who can recognize and develop it in others." As they walked together toward the training areas where Jessica would soon implement her vision for advanced tactical education, she realized that her journey from Viper 7 to PowerPoint Girl to Director of Advanced Tactical Training had taught her something invaluable about leadership: humility and the courage required to use expertise in service of others. The real work was just beginning. But for the first time since David Park's death, Jessica felt ready to accept the responsibilities that came with her knowledge and experience. The PowerPoint Girl was gone forever, but in her place was someone stronger and wiser, someone who understood that true leadership meant ensuring that others could succeed even when the leader themselves remained unrecognized. 6 months after her revelation, Major Jessica Kane stood in the newly constructed Advanced Tactical Training Center at Camp Iron Ridge, watching a group of students execute a flawless hostage rescue exercise under the guidance of instructors who understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. The transformation of the facility had been nothing short of revolutionary, but it was the transformation of the people within it that gave Jessica the greatest satisfaction. The training center itself bore little resemblance to the conference rooms and outdoor areas where Jessica had once been relegated to carrying clipboards and enduring dismissive comments. State-of-the-art simulation facilities allowed students to practice complex operations under realistic conditions, while specialized communication labs provided hands-on experience with the kind of advanced equipment they would actually use in deployed operations. But the real changes went far deeper than new facilities and updated equipment. The culture of the training program had been rebuilt from the ground up to emphasize competence over rank, practical knowledge over theoretical study, and respect for expertise regardless of its source. Jessica had personally selected instructors based on operational experience rather than administrative convenience, and the results were visible in every aspect of the program. Major Chun approached Jessica during a break between training exercises, carrying a tablet that displayed the LATEST evaluation scores from Pentagon observers. Her demeanor had changed dramatically since Jessica's revelation. The nervous uncertainty that had once characterized her interactions had been replaced by confident competence built on solid understanding of advanced communication systems. "Ma'am, The latest assessment results from Special Operations Command are exceptional, Chun reported with obvious pride. Student qualification rates have improved by 60%, and the Pentagon observers are recommending that our training model be implemented at facilities throughout the Army. Jessica reviewed the evaluation data, noting not just the improved scores, but the detailed comments that praised the practical relevance and operational realism of the training students were receiving. It was exactly the kind of validation she'd hoped to achieve when she'd first requested transfer to training duties 3 years earlier. Outstanding work, Major Chun. Your development of the advanced communication protocols has been instrumental in these improvements. The praise was genuine and reflected Chun's transformation from someone who'd hidden behind theoretical knowledge to an instructor who could prepare students for the communication challenges they would actually face in special operations. Jessica had spent months mentoring Chun, sharing practical insights that could only come from operational experience, and watching her evolve into one of the facility's most effective instructors. Captain Rodriguez appeared from the direction of the tactical training area, leading a group of students who just completed a building clearance exercise. His approach to instruction had been completely transformed since his reassignment, and additional training, the swagger and overconfidence that had once defined his teaching style had been replaced by methodical professionalism and genuine expertise. Major Kane, Rodriguez reported. The students completed the exercise with no safety violations and achieved all training objectives. Their coordination and communication were exceptional. Jessica nodded with satisfaction, recognizing that Rodriguez's comment reflected not just successful training, but the kind of systematic preparation that would keep soldiers alive in actual operations. The building clearance techniques being taught now were based on procedures that Jessica's unit had developed and refined in real combat situations, passed on through instructors who understood why those procedures existed. As the day's training concluded and students began preparing for evening briefings, Jessica made her way to a small memorial garden that had been established behind the training center. At its center stood a simple granite monument inscribed with the names of special operations personnel who had died in service to their country. Captain David Park's name was prominently displayed, along with those of the other operators who had been lost during Operation Nightfall. Jessica knelt beside the monument and placed a small object at its base, a spent brass casing from the final exercise she'd conducted as commander of Viper 7. It had taken her 3 years to visit David's grave and another 6 months to feel worthy of honoring his memory, but she finally understood how to transform her guilt into something constructive. "I kept the promise," she said quietly, her words carried away by the desert wind. "The soldiers we're training now will be better prepared than we were. They'll understand what you tried to teach me about listening to instincts and planning for the unexpected." Master Sergeant Torres found her there as the sun was setting over the Arizona desert, carrying 2 cups of coffee in what had become their evening tradition. He'd been promoted to Sergeant Major and now served as Jessica's senior enlisted advisor, bringing 2 decades of practical experience to the development of training programs. "Hell of a day," Torres observed, settling beside her on the bench that faced the memorial. "Those students are getting the kind of preparation that would have made a difference in a lot of operations I was part of." Jessica accepted the coffee, gratefully recognizing that Torres understood better than anyone the journey that had brought her to this point. "Sergeant Major, do you think we're actually making a difference?" Torres' response carried the weight of experience and the satisfaction of someone who'd seen real improvement in the soldiers under his guidance. "Ma'am, I've worked with special operations units for 15 years. The students graduating from this program are better prepared than any I've seen. They understand not just the technical skills, but the judgment and adaptability that keep people alive when operations go sideways." He paused, watching the last light fade from the desert sky before continuing. "But more importantly, They're learning from instructors who understand that competence comes in many forms, and that the best leaders are those who can recognize and develop talent wherever they find it. Jessica smiled at the reference to lessons that had been learned through painful experience over the past 3 years. The culture they'd built at Camp Iron Ridge emphasized recognition of expertise over adherence to hierarchy, practical knowledge over theoretical study, and respect for the kind of wisdom that could only be gained through facing real challenges under difficult circumstances. A young female lieutenant approached the memorial garden, moving with the confident bearing of someone who'd completed the advanced training program and was preparing for her first special operations assignment. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had reminded Jessica of herself at that age, eager, competent, and determined to prove herself in a demanding profession. "Ma'am," Martinez said respectfully, "I wanted to thank you before I ship out tomorrow. The training I received here has prepared me for challenges I didn't even know existed." Jessica stood to face the young officer, seeing in her eyes the kind of preparation and confidence that she'd hoped to instill in every soldier who passed through the program. "Lieutenant Martinez, remember that the techniques you've learned here were developed by people who faced real challenges and learned from real mistakes. Use that knowledge wisely and never hesitate to share it with others who need it." As Martinez walked away to join her new unit, Jessica realized that this was exactly what she'd hoped to accomplish when she'd first requested transfer to training duties. Young officers were being deployed with the kind of preparation that could prevent the losses and failures that had haunted her own operational career. The memorial garden grew quiet as evening deepened into night, and Jessica found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her from Viper 7 to PowerPoint Girl to Director of Advanced Tactical Training. Each phase had taught her essential lessons about leadership, humility, and the courage required to use expertise in service of others. The PowerPoint Girl had died completely, but her legacy lived on in the understanding that competence could be found in unexpected places, and that the people who seemed least important might have the most valuable knowledge to share. Jessica had learned that lesson through painful experience, and she was determined to ensure that the soldiers she trained would never forget it. As she prepared to leave the memorial garden, Jessica felt David Park's presence more clearly than she had since his death 3 years earlier. She finally understood that the best way to honor his memory wasn't through guilt and self-imposed exile, but through sharing the lessons his sacrifice had taught her, with soldiers who could benefit from that hard-won wisdom. The desert wind carried the distant sounds of students preparing for another day of training, and Jessica smiled as she realized that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The quiet ones weren't useless, they were just waiting patiently for the right moment to change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.